and we'll get started. So jumping back into Photoshop, we talked about two ways of applying materials, either by using the distort tool or by using the filter options in the vanishing point. So another thing I've done here is I've applied materials to my interior walls. And you'll see here that if I open up my group of layers, that there's actually several layers within this group. And each of these is essentially a face of material. So if I turn all of these off, you'll see a bunch of different portions. So what I've done here is I've basically found a material. I've used my distort command and applied that material to a surface and cut out portions I don't need. And one thing I would like each of you to do when you're working in Photoshop is what I like to call work smarter, not harder. So instead of deleting everything that you've included here, one thing that you can do is you can add what's called what's it called?
Overlay.
It's called a vector mask here. But for example, if I create a new layer, if I create a new layer over here, and I click this little icon, that adds this little white space here. And what that does, if you guys aren't familiar, is, for example, I've done it with this layer. If I click on this white box on this layer, and I use my paint tool, I can erase portions without completely deleting it. So black means erase, and white brings material back. So you see the portion I've deleted, which is essentially the doorway and what's behind mullions, was used or was deleted by using that layer mask. So I
Can
always
you come again?
Yeah, I can do that again. Let me just Control Z.
Sorry,
Yeah, no
I
worries.
I didn't come with my glasses, so
Okay. I'm recording this too, Felix, so you should be
okay,
able to go back and watch it
okay.
again. Okay, so we have this layer here. Actually, let me make a new layer or do this in a different layer so you guys can see this a little bit easier. So if I turn this this travertine layer on, and I create a layer mask by clicking this little icon. If I select the white box here, that essentially activates this masking option. See, it says layer mask thumbnail. And so what I can do, so I can start erasing information from this layer by using the paint tool. And so while I'm selected in that white box, if I'm painting with a black paint, that allows me to erase things from that image. But you'll see here, there's a little black speck on that layer. That's essentially telling me this is the portion or area of information that I've deleted. I can bring that information back by painting with a white paintbrush, and I can bring that back. So it's a way of, deleting information, but if you decided that you need to bring something back, using that layer mask is a really good way of doing that. So it's never truly deleting all your information. Okay, so we talked about that. If we go back to our interior walls layer, so you'll see here now, I also have a bunch of these other layers associated with this material. So I have This layer 7 is that wood material. And I've edited the appearance of that material by playing with adjustments. So right here, what I've done is I've clicked levels. So if I go to this layer, and what I did is while it was selected, I went to my adjustments panel, and I went and I selected levels, and that allowed this layer to pop up. And so when I have that layer selected, and let me do this on a new layer because it's probably just easier to see that way. Let's do it on that layer. Okay, so let's, for example, layer 8. What I can do to edit that material is I can go to my adjustments and I can go to any one of these icons, and this time I'll do levels. And what that does is, as you see here, it created a new level layer. And so when I go and edit these levels, if I play around with these toggles, you'll see here that it starts to change the image. But I can turn that layer off, and you'll see here it goes back to the normal image. You also notice that that was transforming everything within the entire Photoshop file. But how do I essentially keep that solely to that wood layer? To do that, and I'll label this layer wood, I'm going to select my levels to layer. If I right click and I say create clipping mask, you'll see here that it added an arrow. And what that did was it basically told Photoshop, I only want the adjustments of levels to apply to this specific layer. So now if I turn this on and off, and let me make that a little bit more drastic, you'll see here it only affects this layer. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to delete that because I don't want that currently. Okay. So another thing I played with here is some blending options. So you'll see okay, so you'll see here my layer 8 is currently set on this multiply option. Let me turn that back to normal. So this is what the normal image looks like. If I play around with my blending modes and I set that to multiply, essentially what that does is it takes the information that's behind it. So you see how there's shade and shadow happening on this surface. If I turn this layer on and I hit multiply, it basically takes that information and applies it to my wood texture. So if you kind of had some lighting set up in Rhino, and you didn't want your material to read so flat in Photoshop, that's a really good way of giving some shade and shadow to your applied materials. So I'll just mess around with that again. So this is before and this is after. And you'll see a difference. It looks a little more realistic, correct? Right? So that's a little bit about applying materials. So let's stop talking about materials and let's talk a little bit about creating environment. So for this demo, I have essentially decided to create a desert landscape. So I've found a couple images on Google Images. I've used that tools command to make sure I'm finding images that have a high image resolution. And one thing I cannot iterate enough is that one image for the background is not enough. It could be a good starting point. As you see here, this is basically 1 or 2 images. But what really will bring this rendering to life is by adding more and more layers and information to it. So what I've done here is, okay, I said I'm in the desert. So I've taken, this was the original image. If I copy and paste this image into my Photoshop file, essentially what I've done is I've scaled it to kind of match the perspective. So things that are closer or larger and things that are farther away or smaller. And using those layer masks, I've essentially selected portions of this with my magic wand tool, and I've erased them. Sorry, let me change that to black. And I erased them. And then I was able to basically just go and place this anywhere I needed to within my landscape. And then I can continue, I can go and start to erase these harsh edges so that it starts to appear as though it's fitting in with the landscape. I'm going to delete some information. I'll zoom in, make my brush a little smaller. Let's delete all those harsh edges. And now you can see it starts to look as though it kind of belongs within that landscape. Let's add, for example, a path, like a dirt path. So I saved one. Here's a dirt path. So let's say I need to add a way, I need to tell the story of how do I approach this building. So I'm going to do that by just taking this image and copy it over to my Photoshop file. And let me just bring this all the way to the top. I'll rename my layer, call it Dirt Path. And one thing I like to do while I'm scaling materials or images is to reduce the opacity so I can kind of see a little bit of what's going on in the background. So I can make this image larger and I'll place it right here. So I could kind of see here, okay, here's the path and here are the stairs and here's the path that basically leads me to my building. Or if you can imagine, this is like a road basically, and this is the house on the side of the road. So I'll go ahead and hit enter to finish scaling. I'm going to turn that opacity back on. And just like I've shown you before, I'm going to create another layer mask and I'm going to start again erasing information. I'm going to delete all the harsh edges. And so now we kind of start to feel like we have the dirt road in our rendering. This does look a little funny at the moment. You probably see this extending a lot farther. So maybe I'll go ahead and use my distort command and extend this road so that it looks like it goes farther into the distance. And I'll kind of play around with it, give it a bit more perspective, apply it some sort of vanishing point to it. And that looks a little bit more realistic. So erase it around the stairs. And there we have a dirt path that comes to our building.
Question, sorry.
Yeah.
The brush that you are using, is it erase you are using or you are painting?
I'm actually painting because like I mentioned before, I've added a layer mask to this layer. So you see here by adding, if I click here and I'm selected in this white box, that activates the layer mask. And so I can use my paintbrush to start erasing. So the black paint erases and the white paint will bring the information back. So I always like to use that instead of actually erasing, because if I ever needed to bring information back, I can do it easily, rather than having to start over, bring the image back in, and start from scratch. Does that make sense? Okay. Another thing we can do, and we're running out of time here, so I'll try to be quick, is we can also paint using different brushes. So I'm going to call this a grass brush. So I'll make a new layer called grass. And if I go to my paint tool and I go up to where it says 500, that's and I click this drop down button, you'll see here that there's a bunch of different brushes I can play with. And you can actually download Photoshop brushes. I'll send you guys a tutorial on how to do that because we don't have time to go through it tonight. But you'll see here I have a bunch of brush types that are called grass Photoshop brushes. So I'm going to choose one of these. So if I click in them and I kind of go off to the side here, you see I have these different stamps or these different types of brushes I can use. So I have a white paint selected right now, but now you see if I click, I basically start to stamp in with that white paint. I'm going to delete that. So what I can actually do, and I can do this using the clone stamp as well. Well, first I'll do it with paint. So I'm going to reduce the size, and I can reduce the size of this by going up to the drop down arrow and clicking size. That's a little too small. You can also play around with the brush size by playing with your bracket keys. So an open bracket makes it smaller, and a closed bracket makes it larger. So that's a good size. So I'm going to select a color from my image here if I hold Control while I'm in the paintbrush tool, you'll see here that activates the eyedropper. So if I hold Control, oh, sorry, not Control, it's Alt. If I hold the Alt key, I can activate the eyedropper tool and click any color. So if I click here, it's going to give me a brown color. If I click here, or let's do here, that'll give me a green color. So I'm going to select something in between. And now I can start painting in grass. But of course that looks a little bit flat because we're just using color. What we can actually do is if we go to our clone stamp tool, clone stamps also use brushes. So what we can do is we can go back to our brush types, select a brush, and what we'll do here is we need to make sure we're in our background layer. I can basically do the same thing. If I select any portion of this image, and let's go back to my grass layer, I can start clone stamping in grass, but this grass will have more color and texture. So now it kind of starts to look like my floating plane is kind of existing within the landscape. It's kind of, okay, there's some vegetation that's growing over the edge of that floor plate. So that's a little bit about stamps. We talked a little bit about adding layers and erasing around them. How do we do glass? That's the last thing I wanted to talk about tonight. Um, so the Farnsworth house, as you guys probably know or can see, all of this is glass, and these are the white mullions. How do I create a sense of reflection on the building so that it looks like, there's glass there? Right now, it looks like it's just mullions, there's no glass, you can just pass right through it. So the way to do that is what I might do is I'm just going to close out of all these first. I am going to save my Photoshop file as it is right now as a JPEG. So I'm going to save this, do a save a copy. And we'll do JPEG. And we'll call this render for glass reflection. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go oh no, what did I just do? Actually, Photoshop is frozen at the moment. Sorry, guys. All right, I'm going to stop the oh, it's not frozen. I just need to finish saving. Okay. Okay. It was hidden behind one of my many windows. Okay, so we've saved that image. And now we're going to go open that image. So my render for glass reflection, and okay. And so now I have that rendering as its own individual image. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring that image, basically the same rendering, into my Photoshop file. And I'm going to make sure that's on the top layer. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reverse the image, right? Because we want to create a reflection that's basically the mirror of what's happening over here. What I'm going to basically do is looking at this window, we'd get the mirror, we'd see what was going on this opposite side of this road. So I want to basically get the reflection of the cactus and some of the other surroundings. So I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, and Flip Horizontal. So now we have the mirror image of that rendering. And now I'm going to reduce this opacity and I'm going to scale this. So I'm just going to make it very small. And I'm going to overlay at least the portions of the building that have glass with some images or image of the cacti. The only thing I don't want to show up in the reflection is the building. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And the next thing I'm going to do, as always, is I'm going to create a layer mask. And now I'm going to basically delete everything that is outside of the window frames. So I'm going to select, well, first I'm going to select the entire image. And I'm going to do that by selecting this icon and holding Control and click. And now I'm going to use my polygonal lasso tool. And I'm going to hold Alt because that is going to deselect areas within my selection. So I'm going to let's delete all of this information. Okay, so now I have everything except for that little portion selected. And if I go here, I can go ahead and delete the rest of that. And now we're just going to go ahead and continue deleting some information. So we wouldn't see anything behind the mullions. So I'm going to go ahead and trace out the mullions. So I'll go ahead and delete that. And so this might be like a little bit more of a time-consuming process, but the result is going to be pretty nice. Just continue to delete those areas. But I think you guys start to get the idea here. Just got a couple more mullions to reveal. So when I zoom out, now there's somewhat of a reflection happening on the glass, and I can reduce the opacity a little bit more because we still want to see through the building, right? We want to be able to see what's happening beyond, but we want to see a little bit of that reflection happening of the context around. So it's that little amount of detail, like adding the reflections, that really makes the rendering look like it's coming to life and that you're actually there in real life. You might also want to, for example, add some reflection. So let's say the sun is coming from this way. I can go ahead and select some of that area, and I'm just going to do this not very pretty. Select the areas with the windows, and on a new layer, I can paint with some white, and let's bring back a normal brush. I can paint some streaks. And if I reduce that opacity, now it looks like a little bit of glare happening on the glass. I would probably use a smaller brush to do that. But does that start to make sense? How to kind of create that glassy look? I know that's a lot. That was a lot to go through in Photoshop. But I did record that last bit